Alrighty, folks. So, welcome back. It's good to see everybody. Hope you're doing well. Happy Wednesday. For our online students, let me just introduce myself. My name's Rick Gallimore. I'm the instructor for this iteration of our capstone course. And behind me, well, in front of me, are going to be the other students. You won't probably see them unless I move over and walk to where they are. Maybe I'll do that at some point. We're using some new technology here in the classroom and experimenting with it to see how it works out. So a couple of things. We've got a person who wasn't here last time. It's Harkmal Singh. Can we just go around and introduce ourselves so that everybody kind of gets to know everybody again? This is Bettina, yeah? Ben? Tyler?
Zach?
Alan?
Dominic? James?
And Tamir. Okay, great. So we're back at it. Trying to think announcement-wise. I've put a fair number of things on Canvas for you that you should take a look at. The first thing is the pretest, and I looked at some last night, but I have not been able to get onto the network here today to see how people did on the pretest. The point, and of course, it's an ungraded assignment. So the idea behind that was to give me a sense of kind of the baseline for where people are at, because there's no sense launching into a bunch of epistemology if, it's been 2 years or whatever since you had a course where you were, forced to say what a valid argument is, and you kind of know, but you kind of don't, or whatever. So the pretest was designed to give me that baseline. Now, if you did great on it, then that's awesome. Congratulations. But the ones that I looked at, and I can't remember who they were, but it seemed like a fair number of people were kind of a little iffy on some of the stuff. And that's okay, because like I said, that's the whole point of not making it a graded assignment, so that there's no anxiety and no apprehension on your part about taking it and getting your own sort of self-assessment, right? Some of the questions, if you missed them, might be due to the fact that there were principles or terminology, like the one truth value principle. That's my name for a classical logical principle, but it's my sort of name for it. So if you missed those kind of things, it might be due to the fact that you just didn't recognize a principle that you really knew under this other name, right? Now, also in addition to the pretest, has anybody not taken it? Okay, that's all right. It's not, like I said, it's not a graded thing. It's more for my benefit. So do take it. You'll have a little bit of an advantage because we're going to talk about, that's the whole point of today, was to spend some time just getting a tour de force. Dominic, I saw a hand.
Yeah, I saw a grade pop up, but I guess you're just like not including that or whatever.
Yeah, it's not going to be counted. It's not going to be counted.
Okay.
So I mean, the only way I could get the thing to launch was if I had it counted as a graded assignment. Otherwise, Canvas didn't.
And I saw like the grade go like in the grades, and I was like,
Yeah. Canvas is something I'm still getting used to as well. But we're gonna work it all out. It's gonna be good. So if you haven't taken the pretest, take the pretest. Online students, you should definitely take the pretest before you watch what I'm going to do here. Just again to get an accurate sort of baseline for where you're at, and it's going to be revealing either way, right? I mean, if you did really well, then great. Pat on your back, you feel good. If you didn't do as well as you thought you would, or if you knew you weren't going to do well because you didn't recognize the stuff, then this is an opportunity to kind of get on the same page as me. That's the point of it. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've posted 2 discussion board posts at this point. The first one is discussion number 1, and I think it's just welcome and introductions. We did that at our very first meeting in the face-to-face setting, but if you haven't already posted your welcome and introduction, please do it. Even though we've already done it, it's an opportunity to, first of all, it'll serve the purpose of throughout the semester, if you're responding to one of your classmates' posts and you can't remember who that person is, you can look back at the welcome and introductions and it'll jog your memory and you'll be like, oh, I remember that's Dominic or that's Zach or that's Tyler or Alan. So that part will be good. And then the second post is the first real post. And it asks a question about Feldman Chapter 1. So we won't meet next Monday, right? We won't meet Friday because we don't meet on Fridays. We won't meet next Monday in class because it's the MLK Junior holiday, right? So there'll be a pretty good little stretch here. It'll be about a week. And that's, in my experience, unfortunately, enough time for even what I'm going to do today to largely evaporate from people's minds. Hopefully that won't be the case for you, right? but it has, in my experience, kind of happened that way sometimes. So over the time apart, go ahead and read Feldman chapters 1 and 2. 1's real short. 2 is a little bit more in depth. Yeah, Tyler.
If the books have yet to arrive, would Wednesday be a reasonable date for due date as opposed to Sunday?
Oh, yeah. So the question, you guys will just have to bear with me. I need to repeat these so that the online folks can hear the questions and it makes sense to them. The question was, what if you don't have the books by Sunday night and you can't post by then? And the answer is, yeah, it's okay. I mean, I understand it's the beginning of the semester, so get the book as soon as you can. You don't need the SOZA book, the big, thick book. We won't need that until like week 7 or week 8. But don't wait until then to get it, because it'll take some time and you'll be behind again. But the Feldman you're going to need to get as soon as possible. Hopefully you can find it used at a decent price, either at Ed McKay or on Amazon or someplace like that. We will start using that. So Feldman, chapter 1 is pretty short. Chapter 2, he starts to develop what he calls the standard view of our knowledge of the world. And so go ahead and read 1 and 2. The second discussion post asks you to consider 4 different views that he talks about. There's the standard view, there's the naturalistic view, there's the skeptical view, and then there's what he calls the relativistic view. All right? And so he describes each of those briefly. He doesn't develop them in much detail. Not to have a spoiler alert or anything, but he's going to defend the standard view. And the standard view is that we pretty much know a lot of the things we think we know. And I'm sort of sympathetic to that, right? But the fun part about doing epistemology is that there are people out there, really smart, bright philosophers, who completely disagree. And they think, in fact, we don't know nearly as much as we think we do. Or there are people who think that the kinds of questions epistemologists have typically been focused on are the wrong questions because they can't be addressed scientifically. Or there are people who think that, yeah, you can ask these questions, but knowledge is really relative. It depends on context, or it depends in some sense on your thoughts and feelings or your beliefs. So these are all challenges, all these other 3 views, the skeptical, naturalistic, and relativistic view, they're all challenges to the standard view of our knowledge. And so my first real question in the discussion post number 2 for you is, given that minimal sort of understanding of what those views are, which one are you most sort of sympathetic to, pre-theoretically, right? That may change throughout the semester. It might be that right now you're you think the skeptical view, that we don't know nearly as much as people think they do. And in fact, there are lots of areas where maybe we can't have knowledge, right? And that would be to embrace some sort of skepticism. And it may be that as the semester goes on, you change your mind. Hopefully, I mean, that's to me part of what's so wonderful about philosophy, is it's a field where it's okay to say, I just found out I was wrong. That's good though, right? It's not good to be wrong, but it's good to find out if you are, because then you can make changes. You can adjust your beliefs in light of the new information, in light of the new evidence, right? That's the whole point of it. And you'll come to see that throughout the semester that that's really what epistemology is all about. That's the field that is my area of expertise. It's what attracted me to philosophy as a teenager, and what still keeps me really excited about philosophy is I'm one of those guys who's always wondering, do we really know this stuff, right? Is knowledge possible? So without further ado, a couple different ways we could pursue today. As I said, my hope is to get us all up to speed on some basic terminology that chances are, because you're graduating seniors in philosophy, you've seen this stuff, you've heard this stuff. I know I had Alan in my intro course years ago, and this will be kind of a flashback, hopefully a good one for you. But the hope is that going over this is your opportunity to stop me and ask questions, right? Because nothing would be worse, I think, than to graduate with your degree in philosophy and say not know what a valid argument is, or think you know, and not know what makes a valid argument valid, or to think you know the difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, only to find out that it's not really what it is, right? I mean, so there's no stupid questions, and there's no embarrassment in this context. I hope you guys get that vibe from me. I'm a pretty informal type lecturer. So what I'm going to do is and this is on Canvas for you as well, the stuff that I'm about to project up here for you. And it's only about 1.5 pages. I think it's under the modules link in Canvas, I believe. Just going to see if we have a... Has anybody already gotten this or seen it or printed it out? Is it under modules? Yeah. So you go to modules, and from where you guys are sitting, is that in focus? It doesn't look like it to me, but I can't... All of these presenting machines are a little different, and I don't see an autofocus, and I'm hesitant to touch anything for fear that reality will disintegrate or something. Because the technology is not my thing, but I think this is going to be cool once we get it working good. All right, so as I said, this is stuff that I show in my 111 Introduction to Philosophy course to the students there as a kind of preamble or preliminary to doing any actual philosophy. And I usually spend about 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, getting through this. So I'm going to try to do in basically this one meeting what I would go a lot slower on in the intro setting. But and if we have to go into next time with this, that's okay. Because again, the goal is to, as far as we can do it, get it right. Not to get it fast, but just to get it right. Alrighty, so starting up here at the top, and Feldman talks about this, you'll see in chapter 1, I believe, where he talks about our basic sources of knowledge, right? And what I would ordinarily do is, in a setting where I had a lot more time and 75 or 80 people, is ask people to help me formulate a short list of the basic sources of our knowledge of the world. All right. Now, I'm not looking for a laundry list of things we know, right? You know that the lights are on in this room. You know that the Earth revolves around the sun. You know that 2 + 2 = 4. You know that you're either really excited right now or really bored right now. You know whether or not you had coffee this morning for breakfast or not. So there's a lot of variety in what you know, right? That kind of spans from the mundane to the to the philosophical. And that's all still part of our knowledge. So in terms of sources of knowledge, I'm working my way up to the very first thing on the list here, which is reasoning on the basic terms and concepts overheads. Working up to that, there are other sources that should be acknowledged. So anybody want to take a stab at what one is? Yeah.
Perception.
Thanks. Yeah, Zach. So perception is a basic source of our knowledge. And again, when I say, I'm assuming here that we know things. So bracket off worries about skepticism for now. We'll do 2 chapters on skepticism and a handful of the articles that will be available for you guys to do your presentations on, discuss problems involving skepticism. So that'll come later. But for now, assuming that we know pretty much what we think we know a lot of things that are the result of perception, right? So how do you know that the lights are on in this room right now? Well, you see it. How do you know that somebody's speaking? You hear it. How do you know what this tastes like, right? Taste it, you touch it, you feel it, whatever. So here's the way I think about it. For perception, anytime your primary way of coming to know something is the result of the operation of your 5 senses, what I'll sometimes refer to as the deliverances of your 5 senses, the end products or the results of sensory perception, then I'm just going to call it perception. All right, so that's definitely one thing. What's another source? Anybody want? Yeah, Alan.
Introspection.
Thanks. Yeah, did you read the chapter already, or did you remember this?
I actually didn't read the chapter.
Great, that's excellent. So yeah, Alan says introspection, right? So I think of introspection as kind of the flip side of perception. If perception is your connection to the external world, the world beyond your thoughts and feelings, then introspection is your connection to your internal world, right? So it's sort of heads and tails, right? I know that the lights are on in the room because I see it, but I know what thought I'm thinking right now, right? Suppose I'm thinking the thought that I wish this were a cup of coffee instead of a cup of water, which would kind of be nice to help me wake up in the afternoon here, right? I know that I'm thinking the thought that I wish this were coffee instead of water by a kind of internal relationship that I have to my own mind, right? I can directly introspect my own thoughts and feelings. Now, as an aside, there's been a considerable amount of debate over the past maybe 20 years, 25 years in epistemology as well as in philosophy of language over just how reliable our access to our own minds is, right? So we'll see later when we discuss skepticism, and thinking back to, say, Descartes, right, and Meditations, the project that he's embarked on there. He's worried about how he can know that there's an external world, and the question is, well, you learn it through the operation of your five senses, it's perception, but perception's fallible, right? And that sort of sends him down the rabbit hole, thinking about various skeptical alternatives. Since that time, right, in the last 25, 30 years or so, philosophers have wondered, might we not be in that same sort of predicament with respect to our own thoughts and feelings? What if it's not only the case that you can't know that there's water in the cup, but I can't even know that I'm thinking the thought that there's water in the cup because of some sort of barrier to me having that kind of knowledge? What would the barrier be? Well, different ones have been suggested. One idea is that maybe what thought you're thinking isn't entirely determined by what's going on in your mind. It's partly determined by facts in the world, by causal connections. So if I think that I'm thinking the thought there's water in the cup, what gives that thought the meaning that it has, the content that it has, is that the word water is causally connected to H2O, to stuff in the world. But if it's not, if it were causally connected to XYZ, then I wouldn't be thinking the thought that there's water in the cup. So this is something we'll have to think about. This is what I sometimes called internal world skepticism. But for now, we'll take it for granted that introspection is the source of a lot of our knowledge. It's the source of your knowledge about your own mind right now. So it's how you know your own thoughts and feelings. Okay? Sound good? What's another source? Anybody want to try? There's a few more here. Memory, yeah, thanks. Bettina? Is that right? Yeah. So, yeah, Bettina says memory, and that's absolutely right. We got to have that on the list, right? Because memory is our connection to the past. Now, memory is different than introspection, right? And that's important to be aware of. Introspection is how you know your current thoughts, what you're thinking right now, what you're feeling right now. If you're tired or happy or bored or engaged, if you have a sensation of pleasure or a tickle or an itch. You know all of that stuff in real time, stream of consciousness via or vis-a-vis introspection. But you know whether or not you had coffee this morning, or you know where you parked your car by memory, right? You remember it. And again, memory, there's been a lot of work done on memory. It's certainly a topic that's fair game. If anybody wants to take a look at the table of contents in the Sousa book, there's some stuff in there on memory. Feel free to write your final paper on that topic. All of these are fair game topics as far as I'm concerned. Keep in mind that the analysis of memory also does involve a kind of causal connection to the past, right? It has to really be you can only correctly be said to remember something if in fact it happened. Otherwise it's a pseudo-memory, it's a false memory, a virtual memory, right? A lot of Hollywood films have gotten a lot of mileage out of this idea of playing with memory. So films like Total Recall and Blade Runner, I don't know if people have seen those. Blade Runner is my personal favorite science fiction film. Are they really? I hope they don't mess that up. So the comment was that they're going to be remaking Blade Runner, and anytime they remake your favorite film, you're invested, right? You don't want to see them mess it up. But in any case, in Blade Runner, the replicants, right? They're basically humanoid-like beings, but they're not us. They're not. In fact, they're not natural kinds at all. They're artifacts, right? Those replicants are given memories. Basically, they're false memories that are implanted into them, according to the storyline, to make them more docile and controllable. So if you haven't seen Blade Runner, check it out. It's amazing. But certainly a lot of Hollywood films play with this idea. There was Memento a few years back. People might have seen the film Memento. Regarding Henry, I think, is another one, where the importance of memory is at stake. And so, again, a lot of work done on that, the proper analysis of memory. People in other areas study memory as well, right? Like in psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience. Their interest in memory is going to be different than the philosopher's interest. Our interest is in how reliable it is from the standpoint of justifying our beliefs about the past. So you might be a skeptic about memorial knowledge. You might think that because our memories are, according to, say, empirical science and scientific work, maybe we find out that memory is not nearly as reliable as we thought. Maybe we find out that people confabulate things, that people make things up. A bunch of people watch the same event, and then later they all tell different versions of the story, right? So that's starting to sound like somebody making the case for moderate sort of skepticism about claims based on our memories. So good. So we've got perception, we've got introspection, we've got memory. Anybody want to give us another one?
Testimony.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so testimony. That's one that I think a lot of times just kind of slips right by. Testimony, here's the way I think about testimony. You hear the word and you immediately think of a legal context, right? That so-and-so is giving their testimony, sworn testimony, what have you. That certainly counts, but the way philosophers or epistemologists are using that term, it's much broader than that. It's basically this. Anytime your primary reason for believing that something is true is the result of the say-so of some source or other, then that counts as testimony. All right? So when you read it in the paper, when you read it on the web, when your best friend tells you, when the political authorities or the religious authorities, your mom, your dad, all these and countless other sources count as testimony, right? And here's the thing: is it seems that we have to rely on testimony. There's a debate. Again, all this stuff is up for grabs in contemporary epistemology in the literature. Somebody might think that testimony is not, in general, a good source of evidence. It's not something that we can ultimately rely on. Other people think that we can't help but admit testimony as a bona fide source because there's a kind of practical argument. There's a pragmatic argument, right? I mean, it's great in theory to think that you can check everything out for yourself, but we all know that that's just not possible, right? It seems that we have to rely on the testimony of other sources in everyday life just to get by, right? I mean, if I read the box of cereal and the list of ingredients on the box, I'm taking the manufacturer's testimony right there, in a sense, that that's what's in this cereal, right? I don't check it out myself typically. I believe the label on the box. So from mundane matters to high level matters, right? I mean, if some mathematician tells you that this mathematical claim is true, yeah, you could sit down and try to do the proof, but in most cases, people just take that at face value. They think, well, this guy's a mathematician, he's an expert, whatever, so I can trust this person's testimony. I can rely on that, and thereby come to know that that claim is indeed a mathematical truth. Right? So certainly, one other important thing to note about testimony that's worth mentioning here is that while I agree, I'm on the side of being one of the friends of testimony. Just put it that way. I think that testimony is something that we have to admit as a bona fide source of our knowledge of the world. I do think that we might have to qualify our thinking about testimony a little bit in the following way. Seems to me that testimony can't be the whole story. In other words, we can get knowledge vis-a-vis the testimony of others, of sources, but ultimately the testimonial chain has to ground out in some other source that's not testimony. So for example, if I want to know what time it is, and I ask Bettina, and Bettina says, well, it's 10:35. And I say, that's great, how do you know? And you say, well, I asked Ben. And it's Ben, right? And Ben said it was 10:35, and I trust Ben. He's a reliable authority on these matters. And so, oh, that's great. Well, Ben, how do you know what time it is? And you say, well, I asked Tyler. And Tyler told me that it was 10:35. And I said, oh, cool, Tyler, how did you get that? And he says, I got it from Zach. Yeah, I got it from Zach. And so we go around the room, right? And eventually we get over to Harkmall, and I say, how did you know? And you say, well, Rick, you told me. I said, well, that can't be because I asked the question to start with. That's a big circle. That's circular reasoning. And isn't circular reasoning always bad? You can't get justified beliefs in a circle. Believe it or not, even that is up for debate in our field, in epistemology. There are some folks who advocate what's called a coherence theory of epistemic justification, who think that roughly small circles are bad, but big circles are okay. If the circle's big enough, right? And this is a sort of web of belief idea that Quine inspired. And we'll talk some about that later in the semester when we talk about coherence theories of epistemic justification. So I guess my view is that testimony is a bona fide source of our knowledge. There are, I think, good arguments for believing that, but I do think that ultimately, what I would really like to have happen is when I ask the last person what time it is, instead of pointing me to another source, they actually say, well, I looked at the clock on the wall. That's perception. Or I checked my smartphone. That's perception, right? So doesn't disqualify testimony in my book, but it is a qualifying remark about it. Okay, so we've got perception, introspection, memory, testimony. Got another one? I think there's two more sources. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks. So Hartwell says reasoning, and that's the very first thing on my list of basic terms and concepts. That was sort of the point of doing this. Before I get to talking about reasoning, though, I want to get that last source.
Is it rational insight?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Good, good. So you guys are doing the reading, right? Very good. I don't care how you get it as long as you, I care how you get it. But reading it and getting it that way is an acceptable way to get it. So rational insight is another source that Feldman describes in Chapter 1. And I think, yeah, we have to admit that as a source as well. Here's the way I think about rational insight. Admittedly, I think it's the most obscure of the six. I don't think that disqualifies it. I don't think that's a deal breaker. But it is, I think, the hardest one to characterize, and probably because it's so basic, right? Rational insight is the source that enables you to see or know things like A equals A. So the law of identity, right? That's pretty fundamental. That's true. Moreover, it's necessarily true. It's true in all possible worlds, as people say. How do you know that A equals A? Well, you don't perceive it. You don't introspect it. You can remember it, but you can only remember something that you learned to start with, right? In order for you to remember something, you have to have already had the experience. So we're asking, how do you get the experience in the beginning, the very first time? You can get it from testimony. Like I could say, hey, Ben, does A equal A? And he's, yeah, sure. So I got it from his testimony, but then we're back to that. We're on the wheel. How did he get it, right? So it doesn't look like testimony is going to help. And we're not really reasoning to it. I mean, I'm going to say a lot more about reasoning here in a bit, but it's not something you have to reason to because it seems you don't have any premises, you don't have any assumptions, so to speak. You just, as soon as you understand what A is and you understand what identity is, you're in a position to see that, yeah, A equals A, and it has to be itself. Everything is itself and not something else, right? Likewise for simple conceptual truths, right? How is it that I know that all red things are colored? That's what philosophers or epistemologists would describe as an a priori truth. Right? It's something that we know, and yeah, you had to have some experience to get the concept of red and the concept of something being colored, but once you've got those concepts, once you've correctly acquired those concepts, you should, if you fully grasp them, be able to just see that, well, yeah, of course all red things are colored. It's part of the concept of being a red thing that a thing be colored. You couldn't have a colorless red thing. That's crazy. That's weird, right? That's contradictory. So we need to have, and again, part of why we're constructing this short list of sources of our knowledge is because we want to be able to account for the range, the totality and the range of what we think we know, right? So among the things that we presumably know are a lot of these conceptual truths, definitional truths, basic mathematical and logical insights, right? These are all things that are knowable and can't seem to be explained by any of the other sources. So we have to come up with a source to account for that kind of knowledge. That's why we have rational insight on the list. Some people call it a priori insight, right? And I won't try in the time I've got today to characterize it any deeper than I already have, which isn't much, because it's going to take some time. But if we have time in the semester, we'll look at some papers or a paper or two about the nature of rational insight and how it works. But it's up for grabs. It's controversial. There are people who don't believe in a priori knowledge.
I was kind of confused by the whole time you're describing this.
Yeah, you're kind of wondering, like, is this even a real thing? Yeah. Well, as I say, it's up for grabs, and we'll see, as we get further into the semester, into the course, that there are folks out there, famously, Willard Quine, the famous Harvard philosopher, 20th century philosopher, famously rejected the a priori thinking that everything was a posteriori. In other words, there is no knowledge that's somehow insulated from sensory experience. All of it ultimately depends at some level on the operation of our senses. And this may seem familiar to a lot of you as well, because it harkens back to that old debate between the rationalists and the empiricists, right? You got Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, the three great continental rationalists on the one hand, and you get Locke and Berkeley and Hume, the so-called British empiricists on the other hand. And, here they are in the history of modern philosophy, arguing, debating over the nature of, among other things, the nature of our knowledge of the world and of the distinction between a priori and a posteriori claims. Just so we're all on the same page, as an initial characterization, the idea is that a statement, let's say, is a priori. If once you understand it, you're in a position to see that it's true. Typically, many of them also turn out to be necessary truths. But I'm going to leave it open now whether or not every a priori insight is an insight into a necessity. Seems like there might be contingent a priori insights, in which case these concepts, the necessary and the contingent, don't smoothly map on, they're not completely isomorphic to the concepts of the a priori and the a posteriori. So maybe I can know, for example, that I exist a priori. I don't have to make any observations to know that. I can just think it, right? Like Descartes did with the cogito. On the other hand, a claim like water equals H2O, if people like Kripke are right, and that seems to be the dominant view right now, the Kripkean view, I mean, if they're right, then if it's true that water is H2O, then it's necessarily true. Any world that has water has to be a world that has H2O. Doesn't mean you couldn't have a world where something superficially indistinguishable from water fooled you into thinking, right? And it turns out to be XYZ. That could happen. But that's just an epistemic matter. That's not a metaphysical fact, right? The idea being that any time you've got an identity, it's all identities are necessities, right? Goes back to that idea. So great. So that brings us to the last one here, which is my starting point in the basic terms and concepts notes, reasoning. And so I need to say a little bit about reasoning. Reasoning comes in two main varieties, right? There's deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Anybody want to take a stab at trying to say what the difference is? I mean, again, there's right and wrong, so to speak, but you're not going to be made to feel bad either way, whatever you say. So what do you think the difference is? But yeah, Alan.
Inductive reasoning, if I remember correctly, is always invalid.
Okay, it is. That's true.
And basically, inductive logic would be something like, every crow I've seen today is black. Right. So the next crow I see will be black.
Okay, great. Thanks. I appreciate it. So just to repeat the question again for our online folks, Alan's saying that inductive reasoning is invalid. And I haven't characterized validity formally yet, but I'm going to get there. And he's right about that. Inductive reasoning is not deductive reasoning. They're different, that's for sure. But then his example was of a case of inductive reasoning. Suppose that every crow that I've seen to date has turned out to be black in color. And I'm contemplating the proposition the next crow I see will be black, right? I think if you've seen enough crows over a long enough period of time, most people would say that inference is good. Right? Well, what makes it good? Why is it okay to draw that conclusion rather than the counter-inductive conclusion that, well, maybe the next one's going to be purple? Seems like I should believe the next one's going to be black, but I shouldn't believe the next one's going to be purple. Why is that? Well, in short, it seems like all of those past experiences get that belief justified, right? But we know that the argument for the conclusion that the next one will be black, it's not a valid argument, right? The reason it's not valid is because it's entirely possible, someone like Hume would say, right? It's entirely possible that there be an albino crow, and we just haven't seen one. Hume's point, of course, usually involves the sun rising tomorrow. He says that there's no contradiction, and he's right about this point, right? That there's no contradiction in the thought that the sun not rise tomorrow. It could be the case, right? As opposed to saying something like, I found a colorless red thing. You know that's not going to ever happen. You're never going to stumble across that. But you might stumble across an albino crow. So here's the way I think about deductive and inductive reasoning. One initial sort of approximation for you. Deductive reasoning is reasoning that involves valid argument forms. Inductive reasoning is reasoning that involves what I'll call cogent argument forms. Now, Some words about the terminology. The word valid is drawn from logic. Logic is the science of inference, or the study of correct inference. So it's a technical term, and I'll get to the definition of it in just a second. But these valid arguments, right, these are arguments that are intended to guarantee the truth of their conclusions. In other words, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. It must be true. We say that arguments that have that property are deductively valid, or just valid for short. All right? Bear in mind, and this is a thing that happens a lot with introductory philosophy students, not so much at this level, but I still want to get it out there, that when we assess an argument in terms of whether it's a valid or cogent argument or an ill-formed argument, when we make that assessment, we're not talking about the actual truth or falsity of the premises or the conclusion in isolation, right? So you can have a valid argument with all false premises and a false conclusion. The reason why is because the definition of validity is hypothetical, right? If the premises were true, would the conclusion have to be true? If it would, then the argument's valid. If it would be possible, not just actual, but even just possible, to have all true premises and a false conclusion, then that's enough to show that the argument's not a valid argument. We would then, the next step would be to figure out whether it's an inductive argument, whether it's a cogent argument, right? So valid arguments are arguments that are deductive reasoning, right? And they're intended to guarantee the truth of their conclusion, whereas the inductive arguments don't have that feature. That doesn't mean that they're not acceptable. The way I think about arguments is, at the very highest level, we've got the category of arguments. That subdivides into two other categories, the well-formed arguments and the ill-formed arguments. We're just talking about structure now, right? The well-formed arguments further subdivide into the deductive arguments and the inductive arguments. The deductive arguments being the valid ones, the inductive arguments being what I'll call the cogent ones. There's never been a consensus, as far as I can tell, on what the terminology should be to describe good inductive reasoning. The word cogent is the one that I'm using following Feldman in his presentation, but in other contexts you should be aware, like if you were to take a logic course, a formal logic course with somebody else using a different text, they might, or a practical reasoning course, they might use the word cogent to mean an inductive argument, all of whose premises are reasonable to believe. I'm separating that out right now. So for me, when we talk about an argument being cogent, we're just describing the form of the argument, whether it's deductive or inductive. All right. So if an argument's neither deductive nor inductive, right, then it's not well formed. It's over on the side of the ill-formed arguments. All right. And I'll put some stuff on Canvas as well to try to help you out. Some taxonomy stuff. I can show you real quick here, just a little. I'll try to find it when I get home and put it on Canvas for you. But here's essentially the breakdown. All right. So we've got the arguments, we've got the well-formed, the ill-formed. The well-formed are either valid or cogent. Notice that a cogent argument, a good inductive argument form, is invalid. And that, again, that's just because it's possible in inductive reasoning for all the premises, let's say, to be true and the conclusion be false. What makes the cogent arguments cogent? Well, it's the probability that the assumption of the premises confers on the conclusion, right? So if I say most people in this room are under 35 years old, right? And then I pick a person at random. Given just that information, I say, pick Smith. What should you believe about Smith's age? Well, it seems, again, like it's more reasonable to believe that Smith's under 35 than that he's 35 or older, just given only that limited amount of information, right? Why is that? Well, because I said most people. It's still consistent with it turning out that Smith's 45 years old, right? Because I didn't say all. That's the difference between the quantifier all and the quantifier most, right? So bear that in mind. So the way I think about, if I had to define, right, well, I'll get to it in a second, but if I had to define what it is for an argument to be a valid argument, I would say that it's one where if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. I've got that definition down here, you can see. In a case of a cogent argument, what is that going to be? Well, it's an argument that, first of all, it's not valid, but it is such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would probably be true. So there's a probability associated with it. What do we mean by probable? More than 50%. So anything from 50.0001 up to 99.9 repeating. Anything within that range is going to count as being probable, more likely than not. Notice that means that these cogent arguments, these examples of inductive reasoning, they have degrees of strength. So a cogent argument, they come in degrees. An argument could be better as an inductive argument than another inductive argument by conferring a higher probability on its conclusion, right? Whereas in a valid argument, in a case of deductive reasoning, if it's valid, it's valid. They're all sort of created equal. They're all in the same playing field. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of, in your mind, separating out questions about the actual truth and falsity of the premises and the conclusion taken independently, right, in isolation, from questions about the form of the argument, whether the argument has a certain structure or not. So I've got this definition of reasoning up here. It's my definition. It's not meant to be suitable for every purpose, right? Some fields, other fields study reasoning. So I'm thinking of psychology and cognitive science and neuroscience, and they would have maybe a different account of what reasoning is. But the way I think of it is it's a mental process whereby we take beliefs that we've already got and we ask ourselves, assuming these beliefs are true, what else do we then know? Can we infer anything? Do we know anything on the assumption of the stock of beliefs that I've already got? So it's primarily that kind of reflective, critical mental process. What's the goal of reasoning? Well, again, there's debate, but I think that from my standpoint, the goal of reasoning is to come to know the truth about whatever topic you're thinking about, to come to know the truth about the matter. So that takes us to the next big question, which is a huge one, right? What is truth? You can see where this is going, right? It gets a bit tedious, but it's for a good purpose. So the next principle that I've got up here is what I call the objective theory of truth, and it's on the handout or on the Canvas notes. You can take a look at it when you get a chance. And this is my label for it. So if you missed questions on the pretest about OTT or the objective theory of truth, it might have been because you just didn't recognize the principle under this label. The title, the label for it that you find in the literature is actually the correspondence theory of truth, right? You might have already, been familiar with that. Here's the basic idea. When we ask what truth is, first we want to know what are the proper objects of truth or falsity, right? And this is a question about the so-called truth bearers. What are the truth bearers? According to this principle, the truth bearers are statements or propositions. I'm using statement and proposition interchangeably, and I'll probably continue to do so for the rest of the semester. There might be a certain context where it's important to distinguish the concept of a proposition from the concept of a statement, but I'm not going to do that here. A proposition is anything that can be true or false. All right. So this theory, OTT, what it says is that a statement is true if and only if the statement corresponds to the facts. In other words, the way the world is. Some important things to keep in mind, and you guys stop me at any point. I mean, you can raise a hand, and I'm happy to take questions. I said before the last meeting, right, that I see this course ultimately being more of a seminar with more discussion and less lecturing by me, but the first few meetings may be more didactic, just to make sure we're all on the same page with our terminology, and that's fine. But do stop me if you've got questions. So some important things to notice about OTT. What it says is that truth is a relationship between statements and the world. That's why it's called the correspondence theory in the literature. This is all controversial, and I don't have a problem admitting that and saying that, right? I mean, there are people out there who disagree with the correspondence theory of truth. There are people out there who advocate coherence theories of truth. There are people who advocate relativistic theories of truth. There are people out there who are skeptical of all this. Yeah, Dominic.
Now, I haven't been to the reading yet, but so would a relativistic theory of truth be kind of like, well, the way the world is or the way we really perceive it kind of thing?
Yeah.
It's like, to me, when I read that, like, your statement's true only if the statement corresponds to the facts, like how the world is.
Right.
So, like,
And then you want to say, well, who determines how the world is?
yeah,
Or
if
what?
you think of, like, 2 millenniums ago, when they were just, like, trying to find, like, if the world, how it was flat, or how it, actually, interaction with the universe, like, the way the world was, to everybody, it seemed like it was flat. But then,
Right.
once they were able to perceive that it wasn't actually flat, then they could actually say, okay, it's not flat because saying the other than when it's flat would be like, okay, well, how do you know that, you know?
Right, right.
It would take some other kind of perception or some other thing that was like relative to how you like acquire that knowledge, you know? There's no way that somebody's like, okay, well, it's a sphere, and, you know, rotates, you know, and
Right, right.
it's a solar system, you know, like, we just don't know that. You know, it's like,
Okay.
how do you acquire our knowledge, you know?
Yeah, thanks. Let me just, for the sake of our online kids, and I hate to keep doing that, or online students rather, but just to repeat this question. So Dominic, one of your classmates, has asked this question about the proper understanding of the objective theory of truth and whether or not there are these facts, right? Like who determines the facts, and you know, are they socially constructed, or what do we say about cases where people disagree or where our knowledge has advanced? I wanted to give Tyler a chance here before I say what I want to say back, because I saw your hand.
I was just gonna say, yeah, it seems like that kind of comes down to what you were saying before, though, about defining what truth means. And
Right.
if you look at truth in a naive sense, then the way the world is just the way things are, regardless of how we're involved. But
Our thoughts
so
and feelings.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it seems like that's
Good. So thanks, I appreciate it. So let me see if I can kind of pull all this together. So Dominic's given us this example to think about, and it was, ironically, that's the one I was going to use too. So consider the ancients, right? They believed that the earth was flat. And the little ancient school children, they were taught that by their teachers, and the teachers were presumed to be the experts, right, of their day. And everybody believed that, let's suppose, most everybody believed that the earth was flat. And it looked flat, right? I mean, barring mountains and valleys, if you can't see it from space, then yeah, it seems like it's flat. It seems like the kind of thing that you could sail off the edge of. What do we want to say about those folks? Or here's a question. What does the objective theory of truth imply about the ancients who believed the statement, the earth is flat, to be true? I think what it says is that they were wrong. They were mistaken. Now, again, some people may push back on this a little bit and say, well, wait a minute, Rick. I mean, that's not fair to the ancient people. I mean, you're criticizing them, and how can you judge them? And, you know, why are you the one who gets to say? I'm not the one who gets to say it. Nobody gets. I mean, when people ask me who's to say, like this is a kind of common thing, the who's to say argument. In a lot of cases, I think the right response is, you've missed the point. Nobody's to say. It's not a matter that's up for stipulation or for consensus, right? I mean, another problem that people sometimes have, or the kind of blowback that I get when I present this stuff, is some people will say things like, well, that's terrible. How do we know that we're not in the same predicament as the ancient people right now with respect to a lot of the things that we think we know? And my response is, yep, you're right. We could be in that same situation. I mean, I think that's an attitude of humility, of critical humility. I mean, I don't know any other way to get, what am I supposed to do? Say, you know, there's no way we could turn out to be wrong about a whole bunch of things we believe right now? Well, of course not. We know we can. It happens all the time. I mean, that's why people do science, right? And that's why science is the history of one failed theory after another. It doesn't mean that we give up on science. It means that we have a more subtle and nuanced understanding of how it is that science makes the progress that it does, right? The idea maybe is that we're getting closer to the truth. It's approximating truth. But science is ultimately accountable to the tribunal of experience, right? It comes down to that. If scientific theories don't make the correct predictions, then we modify them. Hopefully we don't just insist that no, our theory's got to be right and deny the evidence or deny the various predictions. So yeah.
So I guess that's kind of saying that truth is actually more approximate than what we actually think it is, to a certain extent. Like, so if truth corresponds with the facts, like the way the world is, and a statement's only true if it,
really does.
That,
yeah.
If it really does.
It really does. So you could think like, well, what about like if it's really, really close to being true? Well, it's false. It's false. It's just not false by much, right? Or by little. So yeah, and this topic of approximate truth is really kind of cool and controversial and frankly hard, right? Because and this comes up in the philosophy of science a lot. People talk about, well, how should we understand scientific theories? Are they meant to be taken literally, as being literally true or false, or are they better understood as models, right, that somehow can be better or worse, like the Bohr model of the hydrogen atom, right? It's maybe not quite right, or in quantum mechanics you see this a lot, right, where the explanations, if you talk to physicists in the area, they'll say, well, people really misunderstand this Schrodinger cat stuff all the time. It's not about cats being, it's a metaphor designed to try to communicate a really complicated idea that sort of is counterintuitive at the macro level, right? Doesn't mean it doesn't have value, but it's just that. It's a model. It's a metaphor. So yeah, I think that, for me, I mean, at least according to the objective theory of truth, if a statement does not literally correspond with the way the world is, then the statement is, strictly speaking, false. But this whole other issue is, well, some statements might be more false than others or something, right? Closer to the truth. Truth-likeness. There's a fancy word for that. They call it verisimilitude. And there's been some work done on that, mostly by people in the philosophy of science. So yeah, good questions. But the upshot of it is that first, it's not being judgmental or somehow unfair to the ancients to point out that, yeah, their belief that the earth was flat was, strictly speaking, mistaken. That's not a bad thing. We're just kind of calling a spade, right? I mean, and it could turn out, and will turn out, undoubtedly, that many of the things we think we know right now will have to be revised, at least, well, put it this way, will ultimately ought to be revised when the time comes that we have good enough evidence for thinking that we're wrong, right? So good. After the objective theory of truth, I got another principle on there, which is the so-called one truth value principle. This principle combines two classical principles from logic. I was just going to slide this out of the way so that light's not right on me. Combines two classical principles from logic, which are the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of the law of excluded middle. All right, I just ran them together in this single principle for convenience. So the principle of non-contradiction sort of speaks for itself. The idea is that a statement can't be both true and not true at the same time. That's contradictory. So an explicit contradiction, formally speaking, is any statement that has this pattern. P and not P, right? That's the one everybody always uses. I'm assuming here, everybody here has had 310, right? Or the equivalent of Introduction to Formal Logic. I'm assuming. Okay, good. So I won't have to go into as much detail on it, but the basic idea is that anytime you've got an explicit contradiction like that, something's gone wrong, right? And one way we can sort of draw that point out is that you know from your experience in formal logic that from a contradiction anything follows, right? It's this principle in logic called principle of explosion that basically says from a contradiction you can infer anything you want to infer, and we can actually give the argument for that. You can state the argument formally. So my one truth value principle first says that you can't have any contradictions. Now you might think to yourself, well, that's kind of harsh on the contradictions. What's wrong with them, right? Why single them out and treat them that way? Right? And there are some philosophers. Graham Priest is a philosopher of logic and a logician who I think he's probably the most well-known defender of this idea of paraconsistent logic, of logic that tries to manage contradiction in a way that classical logics can't do. So in classical logic, the sort of first-order logic that you're familiar with, sentence logic and predicate logic, there, from a contradiction, anything follows. And he's tried to suggest, my boss looking in on me to make sure that the Swivl's working properly for those who are wondering who the thumbs up for. But so these paraconsistent logicians, what they've tried to do is construct logical systems with axioms and rules that from a contradiction you can't derive just anything. There's relevance logic, for example, different kinds of logic that try to handle this idea and incorporate contradictions in a sort of firewall them off, if you will, from the rest of the system. Because clearly, I mean, that's one of the problems with not problem with classical logic, but if you've got a logical system and anything can be inferred in that system, then it seems like something's gone wrong, right? Because the whole point of a system of inference, of a logical system, is to be able to prove certain things, not to prove everything, just to prove presumably the things that genuinely follow, right? Either deductively or inductively. So that's the first thing, it's the principle of non-contradiction. And I'll be assuming these principles in our discussion, but I'm willing to be challenged on any of them. So be aware of that too, right? So there's that. The other principle is the so-called law of excluded middle, which says that for every statement, either it or its negation is true. There's no in between, right? one or the other, but not both. All right? Now, and that principle's been challenged as well, right? So you might think, for example, that there aren't any truths about the future because the future hasn't happened. And so if I say Smith will come to class on Friday, today's just Wednesday, and I say consider the statement Smith will come to class on Friday. That if this principle is correct, then that means it's either true or it's not true right now. But Friday hasn't happened yet, and presumably Smith has some measure of freedom or free will, and things could go either way. The question isn't settled yet, right? So what do we want to say about that kind of case? Well, somebody might say we've got to abandon the famous, law of excluded middle. Aristotle considers doing this in his famous sea battle example, right? About the future, worried about the truth values of what we call future contingent propositions. In other words, statements that could either be true or not true. They're not necessary truths or impossibilities. So I'll be assuming, for our purposes that it's okay. Another thing that people have wondered about with respect to the law of excluded middle is what are the implications of quantum physics, right? Quantum mechanics, where you've got what appears to be genuine determinacy or is genuine determinacy at the micro level. Doesn't that mean that we have to give up the law of excluded middle? So, for example, that particle P is, moving at whatever velocity and at whatever point in space-time. If you can't know the momentum and the position of a particle at the same time because the observation interferes with with collapsing the wave function, which is what happens, right? Then what are we supposed to say about those kinds of statements? It looks like it's not right to say that they're true, and it's not right to say that they're not true because the particle is in some superposition state, let's say. Quine, again, I mentioned him earlier, famous Harvard philosopher, he's suggested that we might have to rethink the law of excluded middle in the face of those kinds of things. I think for us in this class, the kind of stuff we're going to be considering, I'm less worried about it. I don't feel too threatened right now because at least at the macroscopic level, at the level of our ordinary day-to-day experiences, we don't find material objects in superposition states, right? We don't experience them that way. As for the question of, well, Rick, aren't you just kind of staving off the inevitable? What are we going to say about making the connection between the quantum realm and the macro realm? Yeah, it's a huge problem. As far as I know, nobody's figured that out. That's an ongoing area of inquiry, right? Because if it turns, like I consider the statement, the cup is on the table, right? I got my Tate Street coffee cup here and I put it on this table. Consider that statement. Somebody might say, well, look, that's not true because nothing's ever really touching anything else, right? It's just mostly empty space and lattice-like arrays and fields of force and so on, right? So almost all of our ordinary claims at the macro level, they all disintegrate. They all turn out to be false. Is that the case? I don't think I want to say that. I'd like to have an approach that's more constructive, that allows us to say, yeah, when we're using quantum level discourse, there are going to be certain facts and certain truths, and when we go to the macro level, there'll be a different set of facts and truths. But presumably there's some bridge that connects these guys together. All right, cool. So on to the next little bit here. I've got some stuff about modality. Hopefully people are familiar with a little bit about modality, and modal logic is the study of necessity and possibility. It's the logic of necessity and possibility, the boxes and the diamonds. So if you've had a little bit of logic background, you've probably seen this stuff before. If you've taken a course with Professor Hoffman or Rosencrantz, either of them having to do with substance, so maybe the philosophy of religion course here at UNCG or either of their metaphysics courses, then probably you saw some footnotes, some lengthy footnotes with boxes and diamonds, and it looks kind of scary, looks kind of formal, right? And it is complicated stuff, but that's basically modality, that's modal logic. So what I've got here is I've simplified it a little bit. I'm going to talk about necessity, contingency, and impossibility. So we say that a statement is necessary. What we mean by that equals by definition. And just as a terminological matter, I'll follow this convention throughout the semester. The equals df period is a notational device. It's a way of indicating to the reader that what you're getting here is a stipulative definition. In other words, we're not going to look it up in the dictionary. It's not a lexical definition. It's true because this is what we're going to agree that these words mean. All right, basically. So we're not arguing over the meanings of Well, necessary means something else. There's different kinds of necessity, right? There's physical necessity or causal necessity or moral necessity, whatever, right? So a necessary statement is one that's true and not possibly false. Another way of putting that is to say that it's true in all possible worlds. And you've probably heard a lot of people talk that way, right? Philosophers love to talk about possible worlds, and I'll have some stuff to say about them perhaps at some point when we do get a little further into things. But essentially, imagine logical space as all the possibilities. If a statement's necessarily true or necessary, as I'll sometimes just say, then that statement's true at each of those worlds. There is no world where the statement's false. The best candidates for necessary truths, so far as people who believe in this distinction at all, are going to be the truths of logic and mathematics. And then I also think that there are going to be conceptual truths and maybe even some truths about our own thoughts and that we're thinking them that might turn out to be necessary, understood in a certain way. But certainly 2 + 2 = 4. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A has to be greater than C. These are all going to be necessities, right? All red things are colored, things like that. The flip side of necessity, of course, is impossibility. So an impossible statement, if a necessary statement is one that's true in all possible worlds, then an impossible statement is one that's not true in any world. There's no possible world where the statement's true, right? So that X is a 4-sided triangle, that X is a married bachelor, that 2 + 2 = anything other than 4. Those statements are all going to be false and not possibly true. So you can define necessity and possibility. If you take one of those as primitive, you can define the other one, right? So a statement's necessary if it's not possibly false, right? And a statement is possible if it's not necessarily true. All right. The last category here is the contingent, right? So statements, and these are the things that immediately come to mind for most folks when you're thinking about these matters, necessity and possibility. A contingent statement is one that's true but might have been false, or false but might have been true. So the whole host of things you're probably thinking right now, unless you're thinking about a statement of logic or mathematics or one of these conceptual truths, right? Like about bachelors or red things being colored. The lights are on, there's 10 people in this room, it's cold outside, that you're registered for this course, that you're sitting down, right? These are all things that are true, but they're not necessities, right? They're not necessarily true because they could have been false. What does that mean to say that it could have been false? Well, something roughly like we can consistently imagine a way the world might have gone, an alternate history of the world, and had it gone that way, the statements that are in fact true, they turn out not to be true. That's the way I'm understanding what it means to say that it could have been false, right? It's worth pointing out that there's been a lot of work over the past 25 years or so trying to get the details of this language right and understand it more precisely. And part of the worry is that what if our conceptions or our conceptual scheme or our imaginings don't reliably track to the possibilities, right? Just because you can conceive of something doesn't seem to automatically imply that it's possible, right? And this is a worry. So there's a lot of work and a lot of work to be done on this connection between what you can imagine and whether that provides you with good enough reasons for thinking that it is or isn't really possible. So a contingent statement, again, one that's either true and might have been false or false and might have been true is how I'm thinking about it. Let me just pause for a second, see if people have questions about any of this stuff, because the modality stuff often kind of puzzles folks. Hopefully people are pretty good. All right, you're hanging in there, guys. I appreciate it. And I'm almost I'm not going to completely finish this today, but I'll get really close. And then hopefully after hearing all of this, and once I get this lecture uploaded to Canvas, you can go back and look at your pretest, see which ones you missed, and hopefully you can answer a lot of your own questions. But if you don't understand why you missed one of the questions, even after hearing this whole spiel and some of next time, then by all means email me or get me in class before or after class or in office hours so we can get it cleared up. And sometimes I make mistakes myself, right? So there might be an answer key error in one of the test questions. So it's good for you to know why you missed one if you missed one, right? So the next little bit that I've got here on this first page and a half of basic terms and concepts is this stuff on validity and cogency. And you've seen it all before because of your formal logic background. But a valid argument is one, you could put it this way, an argument is valid if and only if it would be impossible, or it is impossible, for all the argument's premises to be true while its conclusion is false, right? Another way of putting that, I have an alternate definition of validity here. Some people prefer this other one. They're logically equivalent. The other one just says that an argument's valid if and only if the following statement is a necessary truth, colon, if the premises were true, then the conclusion is true. That statement itself, that conditional, is a necessary truth, is the way to understand the alternate definition. We know that if an argument's not valid, there are two other options, but every argument at the end of the day has to fall into exactly one of the following three categories. It's either got to be valid in an instance of deductive reasoning, it's got to be cogent in an instance of inductive reasoning, or it's going to be ill-formed. Those are the only three possibilities: valid, cogent, or ill-formed. If you change any term in any of the premises or the conclusion, you got to go back to ground zero and reevaluate the argument, because that can make a big difference, right? I'm assuming everybody already is pretty familiar from either a course in logic or in practical reasoning with how arguments work. They've got two parts, premises and conclusions. The premises are the reasons, as I think of it as an epistemologist. The premises are the reasons for thinking that the conclusion is either has to be true or is probably true. All right? You can have an argument with exactly one premise and one conclusion, and they could even be the same thing. I could say, premise one, snow is white. Therefore, conclusion, snow is white. It's not a very interesting argument. It's a circular argument. From a technical standpoint, it turns out that all circular arguments are valid, but that's not saying a whole lot, right? Because in addition to the form of the argument, we also have to assess the premises, whether they're reasonable to believe, whether they're true. And one of the things we want in an argument is for the premises to be different than the conclusion, right? To give us that reason. Otherwise, there's no motivation, right, to look at the argument or take it seriously. A cogent argument, I've got it defined here. An argument's cogent if and only if it's not valid, but, second clause, if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. All right? So this is all on the side of argument form. We haven't really assessed at this point whether the premises are actually true or reasonable to believe or anything like that. I can show you some examples here, and I'll try to get this on canvas as well. Some examples of valid arguments with different combinations of truth values distributed from across the premises to the conclusion. And again, this is stuff that you probably remember from your own early days in philosophy, like in an Intro 111 or 101 philosophy course. A lot of students really struggling with, really getting confused on this stuff, trying to grasp the concept of what it means for an argument to be valid. One of the things you have to be able to do is separate in your mind questions about the form of the argument. In other words, questions about the relationship that the premises bear to the conclusion from questions about the independent merits of the premises taken in isolation, or the independent merit of the conclusion taken in isolation, right? So you can have every combination of truth values except one in a valid argument. You'll never have actually or even possibly all true premises and a false conclusion in a valid argument, in a good deductive argument, or in an instance of good deductive reasoning. Some of these examples I've got up here, you can have all false premises and a false conclusion. I could say, you know, all people have wings, Mickey Mouse is a person, therefore Mickey has wings. Well, those are all false statements, right? The premises are false, the conclusion's false. Why is that argument valid? What makes that a valid argument? Anybody want to say? Yeah.
Well, it naturally follows that, like, so, how, like, you give the example of, like, all women are rock stars, Bob Dylan is a woman, Bob Dylan is a rock star, so, like,
Yeah.
you start with, like, all women are rock stars, so you have the predicate of rock stars, and the next part is Bob Dylan is a woman. You have the subject here, so you're pretty much combining the subject and the predicate of the first two sentences and the final word.
Yeah, you get it in the conclusion, right? Yeah, thanks. So Dominic's talking about my Bob Dylan example, which I wanted to say something about, first because I like Bob Dylan, but second because this is a particular combination here of truth values that often puzzles people. You think you're getting the concept of validity and you've kind of got it, and then somebody says, but wait a minute, you can have all false premises and a true conclusion and the argument be valid? That's kind of messed up, isn't it? Well, keep in mind, it's because if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, right? This is, again, it's hypothetical reasoning. It's a conditional, right? So in the case of my Bob Dylan argument, all women are rock stars. Bob Dylan is a woman. Therefore, Bob Dylan is a rock star. We know that the premises are false, right? All women aren't rock stars, and Bob's not a woman, so far as we can tell, right? But it is nevertheless true that Bob Dylan is a rock star. What makes that argument valid? Well, here's a way of thinking about it. In a world, a possible world, where all women were rock stars, right? And where Bob Dylan, our Bob Dylan, was a woman, then Bob Dylan would be a rock star in that world too. As it turns out, it's just a matter of coincidence that he's a rock star in the actual world for reasons completely unrelated to the premises, right? So bear that in mind. This is, like I said, this is often confusing for people. Probably not too confusing, maybe, I hope, for this group, since you guys are advanced students, right? But important to separate questions of form from questions of what I call content, the reasonableness of the premises. This is on to the second page now. And again, I would normally spend probably 2.5 weeks going through this page and a half of stuff with my intro students. So we've made progress, and hopefully a lot of this seems familiar, and it's like review for you, so that next week we can get to start getting into epistemology. As far as the last little part here, we've talked about the theory of truth, at least one theory of truth, an influential one, the correspondence theory of truth. This idea that truth is a relational notion that connects statements or propositions, however you want to refer to them, to facts in the world. And I've had to bracket for a little bit at least worries about the facts and what makes a fact and the nature of facts and so on. We're sort of setting that aside. That'll come up probably later. So we've talked about a theory of truth, but we haven't said anything about a theory of rationality or a theory of rational belief. And we need to do that, right? So for a lot of, and this is crucial to this course because this is a course in epistemology or the theory of knowledge. And one of the things that epistemologists have historically been preoccupied with is rational belief, right? One of the things you might think is that, look, I mean, what separates the person who can correctly be said to have knowledge from the person who's just a lucky guesser, right, who just gets it right by luck, is that the person who really knows has some sort of justification, some sort of rational, entitlement, if you will, for believing the claim, whereas the lucky guesser's just guessing, right? So we have to have a theory of that. How's that going to work? Well, as I said before, we were talking about the form of arguments, whether they're valid or cogent or ill-formed. Haven't said anything yet about what makes an argument a good argument, right? So I've got this notion here of an argument's being strong, a strong argument. You'll remember from logic, in your days in logic or practical reasoning, that there's also this notion of soundness. People talking about an argument being sound or unsound. That's a technical term drawn from logic. A sound argument is, by definition, a valid argument with all actually true premises. All right? Nothing wrong with the notion of soundness. The reason I don't use it is twofold. First of all, it doesn't apply to inductive reasoning. It doesn't apply to cogent arguments. And we need to have a label, a piece of terminology, to describe those arguments as well when we want to evaluate them, when we think about induction. So if a sound argument has to be valid by definition, then what do we say about the inductive arguments? Got to fix that. The other reason that I sort of resist using it and have switched over to this notion of a strong argument is that there are a lot of cases where somebody says, well, look, what if I can't tell whether the premises are all true? Then I'm not in a position to say that the argument's sound or unsound. Maybe you just can't tell. Well, that sort of stops everything, right? We don't want that to happen. So one way of getting around that is saying, well, look, instead of being concerned with whether the premises are actually true or false in the real world, we can at least ask the question, even if we can't know whether they're actually true or false, we can at least ask the question, are they rationally justified? Am I justified in believing that the premises are true, even if I might turn out to be mistaken, right? It's kind of like back to the ancient school children and the earth being flat. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to admit or to to grant that they were justified in their belief that the earth was flat. They just turned out to be wrong. And we could be in that same spot, and undoubtedly are, right, with respect to a lot of things we believe. So the idea of a strong argument is more versatile. It applies to both inductive and deductive arguments, and it doesn't require that the premises be true. It just requires that the premises be rationally justified for the person who's evaluating the argument. All right? I've gotten almost to the end. I'm still going to have to present the stuff on evidentialism and the theory of rationality that we're going to be sort of presupposing for our look at epistemology, but I'll do that next time. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Did you want